My name is Joellen Haugo, and I'm the co-chair of the Linden Hills History Study Group. If this is your first time at one of our programs, we welcome you and invite you to check out our website at lindenhillshistory.org. For tonight's program, keep your mic muted when you aren't speaking. Remember, if you are using video, we can see you. If you get disconnected, you can re-click at any time. Following tonight's formal program, there will be time for questions and comments. The video of tonight's program, as well as our more recent programs, can be found at our website, again, lindenhillshistory.org, under the tab Updates Videos. We have been presenting local history programs open to the public for over 20 years. We invite you to become a member. Our next program will be on August 24th at 7 p.m. on Women's Right to Vote with a Minneapolis Perspective. As per our past meetings, Linden Hills History Study Group serves as a vehicle for promoting other local history resources. Two things we'd like to mention tonight. One, consider writing or recording your experiences during this time of COVID-19. We are living in historic times. Speaking of COVID-19 and its impact on life, Preserve Minneapolis's popular summer tours have also gone viral. Register for this year's virtual programs at www.preserveminneapolis.org/summer-tours. Very interesting programs are scheduled. The fee for the tour is $6, including registration charge. Now we turn to this evening's program. It is my honor to introduce Peter Sussman. Peter Sussman, local historian, architect, and active member of Preserve Minneapolis, has had a significant role in the preservation and interpretation of Minneapolis's history, and specifically Southwest and the north side of Minneapolis. Some notable projects include the Lake Harriet Bandshell and B'day Makaska Memorial. He has presented many programs over the years, including on local women leaders, organizations, history of neighborhood houses, buildings, their occupants, and businesses. He is known for thorough research, careful deliberation and interpretation, openness to listen and share with others, and impressive recall of facts and dates. It is my pleasure to turn the program over to Peter.
Thank you, Joellen, and good evening, everybody. This was planned originally as a walking tour, which I do most summers for the Linden Hills History Study Group, but obviously this is a virtual presentation, so I've adapted to that format. The concept of the presentation is one that I'd been giving some thought to, and I named it a half year ago as being the third wave of Linden Hills development. These are not formal periods of time. They overlap to some extent. And I'm going to start by mentioning that I'm going to bookend those three waves of development with the context of the Dakota experience, both historically and in modern day. So that sort of wraps the beginning and ends of the program. The shores of B'day Makaska had a village that was Cloudmen's village, Heata Otanwa, and that village was present in the 1820s through 1839, and the legacy of that time is what precedes the development of Linden Hills. We have for many years assumed that that was a historical event and it's in the past, but as you'll see, the Dakota culture is alive, and the commemoration of that culture and the setting is very much in the recent past, these last few years. But the people who have told the story of the lake were the Indian agent Lawrence Tolliver, Prescott, the farmer at the village, and the Pond brothers, Samuel and Gideon. The starting point of development really is when land becomes available as a result of treaties that the Dakota entered into with the government, and the land becomes what I refer to as a commodity, really a change in cultural and economic perception of the use of the land. So this occurs about 1853, 1854, and the earliest landowners in the area of the lakes include the Hamilton family. And this is Ezra Hamilton, one of William's sons, and a manuscript that he wrote later in life, and it's in the California State Library. And it recounts his coming to Minnesota from California and taking over his father's estate, which included the south shore of the lake. Now, I'm going to refer through most of the program to the 200-year-old name of Lake Calhoun because as these events happened, that is the name which the participants were using at the time. The Hamiltons had ownership of the southern shore of the lake, and they had a guest house. This was widow Hamilton, Elizabeth Hamilton, William's wife, ran a guest house, and there were visitors from around the country, typically in the summer from the southern states, but there was a very unique visitor in June of 1861 who was Henry Thoreau, the naturalist, and his traveling companion, Horace Mann, Jr. They stayed at the Hamilton House on the lake for a week, and they visited the surrounding, largely unchanged natural setting, which included the low-lying wetlands and the upper woodlands. So here's a quote from a letter Horace sent home to his mother about the experience of staying at the Hamilton home. He's an Easterner coming from Massachusetts, and he sees that things are still pretty raw. They've just been changed by some farming in the previous few years, but he talks about the size of the mosquitoes and drinking water from the lake. Thoreau was not in good health, and that was the purpose of his visit, and he kept a notebook with his field observations, but passing away a year later after this visit, he never published that. It's been published more recently, but these are some of the notes from his journal. And ultimately, around the year 2000, the Minneapolis Park Board used those observations to reestablish some of the plantings in the wetlands and the filtration ponds at the southwest shore of the lake. So as I mentioned, this land becomes a commodity. It's claimed and it changes hands, some of it several times. And there were three principal property owners in the area that became developed and known as Linden Hills. By far the dominant landowner was Colonel William King, and he owned more than 1,500 acres bordering the east shore of Lake Calhoun and the west, north, and east sides of Lake Harriet. And he ran this Lindale farm. So that included a good part of the eastern part of Linden Hills. To the west, starting at Beard and running into what is now Edina, was the Jonathan Grimes family. He had moved as a young man through Indiana to Minnesota around the late 1850s and bought what we refer to as Edina Mills at Minnehaha Creek, and eventually owned up to what is now Beard Avenue. So that was the Lindale farm, and the Lake Calhoun nursery came together at that line. The southern part of the neighborhood was owned by Charles Reeve, who bought it from the Thorntons, who also had a guest house, and he used that as his summer residence for years. So those were the large landowners in the area that became Linden Hills. There were several smaller landowners, but those are the ones that were the principal entities, and they were the ones who set about eventually platting the property for development. Before that occurred, Lake Calhoun was very much a resort area. Now, starting in the 1860s, visitors would stay at small guest houses and hotels, but it was really in the late 1870s when the narrow gauge motor line extended to Lake Calhoun that visitors were attracted in large numbers. The motor line company had a excursion steamer on the lake called the Hattie that operated for 7 or 8 years. And there was a private rowing club called the Lurline Club at the foot of Lake Street. Their boathouse is pictured in the lower image there. A few years later, after the motor line had come through in 1879 to Lake Calhoun and in 1880 to Lake Harriet, the Minneapolis Board of Park Commissioners was formed through an election in 1883, and they hired H.W.S. Cleveland of Chicago to design a master plan for the Minneapolis park system. The lakes bordering Linden Hills were one of the main natural features of the area, and so certainly Cleveland included not only park boulevards extending to the lakes, but also intended there to be several larger parks around the lake itself. So the route from town was going to go on the west shore of Lake Calhoun at the Heights, which is now the Minnetonka Club, and extend all the way around Lake Harriet. But one of the unique aspects of the Linden Hills area is clearly the proximity to the lakes and that amenity. There's an inherent value, and as we'll see, the area was just a little bit too far from the city initially for there really to be a lot of development, but ultimately that is the most unique feature that has continued to attract residents. So now we're into what I call the first phase of development, starting with land ownership, but then going into the developers promoting the area, including speculation in property as the city was booming. And there were small pockets of residents in the 1880s. This is Cottage City on the south shore of the lake. And these are 5 structures that were there from the 1880s into the early 1900s. From the left side, that is Charles and Mattie Mousseau sitting in front of their tamarack log cabin, which actually existed until just a few years ago, although it was clad in other siding and a little bit obscured by landscaping. That was the last cottage on the lake shore. At the top is the reality that the shoreline came down along most of the south shore in a hillside, and the land was privately owned right up to the water's edge. So there was no public access for years to the south shore of Lake Calhoun. Going down from the left side, one of the early families that built a very modest cottage in Cottage City in the mid-1880s was the Farwell family. And that's a photograph in 1910 taken by the second owner, which was Charles Hibbard, who was a commercial photographer. And he took this photograph of the cottage, so I refer to it as the Farwell Hibbard cottage. Going to the right, very prominent, well-known spot on the lake was the May House. And that was, the Mays were residents from the late 1880s. And these were year-round residents for the most part. And one could take this excursion steamer or a carriage out to the lake and visit the house where he served. It was basically a restaurant. There were no overnight lodgings, but it was basically a roadhouse. And on the right, one of the most prominent families to live in the area, starting in 1890, was the Uland family Andreas and Clara Uland lived in the house, which is actually on the site of the Hamilton house, which Thoreau stayed at. It was a prominent spot with a view of the lake, and they owned about 11 acres that was subdivided from the original Hamilton holdings. So just a little bit later, Lake Harriet becomes a center for recreation and entertainment. There were never any large hotels built on Lake Harriet, but the steam motor line starting in 1880 gave access to a lot of people, and initially there were just small boating operations, including by Jonathan Palmer, who was contracted with the motor line. And then Thomas Lowry takes over the motor line and starts to develop the area, first with the pavilions in 1888, and then he actually names the area on the west side of Lake Harriet Linden Hills. It's Lowry's naming of the area as an act by a developer before the community existed in 1889 because of the linden trees, the American linden or basswood tree, which was prominent on the hillside. So 1891, there's the second large pavilion designed by Harry Wild Jones. It's really, it's described sometimes as the Coney Island of the West. There was a merry-go-round and all sorts of activities. There were large fireworks, which weren't exactly compatible with the early residents that came to live by Lake Harriet. A little bit later on, there was a third pavilion, 1904, a classic revival-style pavilion, very popular. Canoeing was popular. This is the Lake Harriet Canoe Club. So people are aware of the area that became Linden Hills primarily because of this recreation and the entertainment that was at the lake. The pavilion era lasted until 1925, and there would be thousands of people coming mostly by streetcar for many years. Linden Hills was essentially a streetcar village. The line extended from the depot and the pavilion at Lake Harriet into what became the commercial core of the neighborhood of 43rd and Upton. There was a streetcar loop at that point. The upper left-hand image is the streetcar crew at that loop as they're waiting for their next run, and in the background is the Lake Harriet Commercial Club, which now houses the Wild Rumpus children's bookstore in addition to other businesses. So this was a private right-of-way, and the line extended out to Lake Minnetonka, actually, and this became just a commercial node from the very early times, certainly by the early 1900s, for the much larger area. Even as the streetcar network extended south of 50th Street, this was an area of shops and other services, including a bank and a library, which served an area within a few miles of Linden Hills, which was somewhat isolated from the rest of the city because of a combination of Lake Calhoun, Lakewood Cemetery, and Lake Harriet. So as part of, now we're getting into the development of what we know today as the community, and that's what I refer to as the second wave. It's, again, overlapping, but what I see as the second period is when the community is established and is self-identifying. They have an improvement association as of 1902. It's no longer being driven by developers selling off large areas and large numbers of lots. So you have one of the big businesses in the area is real estate. In the 1880s, almost the entire neighborhood had been platted, and we'll talk a little bit about deed restrictions. And primarily those deed restrictions started in the 1890s as being building restrictions, say a standard setback from the street, a minimum value of a house, some other criteria. Starting around 1910, another aspect of deed restrictions were racial deed restrictions. And if you look at some of these deeds, there'll actually be a paragraph that's called building and racial deed restrictions. But those restrictions really don't apply to Linden Hills, with some rare exceptions of a few lots that were replatted in the 1920s. There were other real estate practices that discouraged racial minorities from living in the neighborhood. So the woman pictured in the middle is Pauline Littell, who had been working for one of the local realtors with an office down at the Loop, and that was Folsom Realty. And she just went off on her own after some experience with them, and was probably one of the few women realtors with their own business, and she was somewhat of a curiosity, and the newspaper writers would come and interview her. And she was so effective that she said in one article that when the other realtors, who were men, wanted to make sure their customers weren't distracted, because her office was immediately at the Loop. So if somebody was coming to or from Linden Hills, they would see her office right off the streetcar, and the other realtors didn't want their customers to be distracted by Pauline and be drawn to use her real estate firm instead of theirs. So this was a period of time. Pauline, by the way, some notes that I made on this map, Pauline became a home builder as well. And some of the homes that she built are still extant right across from St. Thomas Church on 44th Street, just west of Upton. So there was one experience in 1910 where a disgruntled neighbor who was not getting on well with her neighbors decided to spite them that she was going to sell her house on Zenith, just south of 44th Street, to a black family. And this caused quite an uproar. And what's been interesting to go back to the newspaper accounts is to see it wasn't simply a matter of bias by the immediate neighbors, but if you look at the people who were organizing that effort, it included several of the prominent real estate firms that were operating in the Loop. That seems to have been a relatively unique situation, that one episode, but it's likely that that influenced, set as a reputation, steering black families from considering this area where they otherwise might have bought relatively inexpensive lots and settled. Now, Linden Hills was not developed on a large scale by any particular firm. What had happened was, starting in the 1880s, the ownership was almost entirely fragmented. So on the west side of Lake Harriet, although it was part of King's Lindale Farm, the owners sold that off as speculation to individual investors. As distinct from that, on the east side of Lake Harriet, that part of Lindale Farm maintained a large land holding by a few individuals, including Charles Loring and the David C. Bell Company in particular in the early 1900s. Now, the city council is about to consider and will likely adopt a historic district, a local historic district in the Lyndhurst neighborhood, comprising 66 of the individual single-family homes there. But that is really very much different than the situation in Linden Hills, because as this describes, it was marketed, Lyndhurst was marketed with certain, it's a restricted community, but those really restrictions apply to building restrictions. 2 lots per home, single-family homes only, certain minimum value, lot setbacks, that sort of thing. And a lot of the consistency between the homes on the east side of Harriet are due to that uniformity, that control that one company exerted, which is not the case for Linden Hills. So what were the homes that were built in Linden Hills? We have vernacular starting some cottages in the 1880s, a few larger homes on Linden Hills Boulevard in 1894, but really until the economy recovered around 1898 to 1900, there was very little building in the area that became Linden Hills. At that point, the vernacular included very simple square 1.5 and 2-story homes of the type in the upper right-hand corner. That's at 4031 Sheridan. And then as you got into a little bit later the development in the 1910s, into the early 1920s, the bungalow style was a popular style. This home is just 1 block south of Linden Hills on Washburn, near what was originally Fulton Elementary School. Through the early years where developers were trying to get something started, they kept on referring to and promoting Lake Harriet and Linden Hills as a site for really elite homes. This was going to be an upper-class neighborhood. There were very, very few homes, 3 that I can think of, that were actually built to any higher standard. The closest you would come in the early years was the Uland House, and then you had the Van Tuyl House, designed by Harrowell Jones at the 4200 block of Queen, Tudor Revival home overlooking Lake Harriet. There was the home that was on the present site of the St. Thomas Church, the Fletcher home. And then there's this home, which was on a high point in the 4100 block of Vincent. And the property owner came in and assembled at that point 6 individual lots, 3 fronting on Vincent and 3 fronting on Washburn, to create really this estate type of parcel on one of the highest points in the neighborhood, and hired John Jaeger to design this Viennese secessionist style home, which is still there. Jaeger had designed a very nice approach from the Vincent side. This is the landscape plan that stayed in the home, Jaeger's own home on Red Cedar Lane, and has been shared by the present owner. This is an aerial view taken from the Quigley photographs. Quigley was hired by the Minneapolis schools as it was going through a rapid period of expansion to survey the entire city. And these are very large, detailed photographs that are now in special collections at Hennepin County Library. But you can zoom in and pick an individual parcel such as this to have an aerial view from the late 1920s of the Giles home. So the growth is extending to the southwest during this period, and this second phase is what we know as Linden Hills, that was built from basically 1900 into the 1980s, but it was when the neighborhood was basically built out. All of the better land was earlier built on, and then the more marginal land was built on pretty much after World War II. A lot of soil correction required, homes on piling, and maybe a property owner that had 2 or 3 lots eventually sold off those adjacent lots. In the 1930s, the federal government set up an authority which defined for lending purposes the desirability of certain areas. And this is where the term redlining comes in, because if you were in a district which was identified in red, it would be very hard to get any kind of mortgage at all. As it happens, the Southwest Lakes area, including Linden Hills, did not have any of that red district. These are 3 districts within the Linden Hills neighborhood west of Lake Harriet in the late 1930s, and a description of each of the areas. The A area is primarily bordering Lake Calhoun, Minnetonka Golf Club, and the west and southwest shores of Lake Harriet. So proximity to the lakes. These were not fully built up neighborhoods, but there was enough of a character already to identify that as an A classification. The B classification was really reflective, I think, of the fact that many of the homes that were built up in Linden Hills were pretty much modest. They were affordable to a working person who was commuting by streetcar or eventually automobile downtown. And you could build initially even a second structure on the site before the zoning ordinance came in, and then the house itself. So a B classification characterized much of the area of Linden Hills. There was one small C category, which was along the streetcar line extending out to France Avenue, the city borders. And so these are the classifications in the 1930s that the federal government applied. Now, I have to put a little advertisement in for Linden Hills History Study Group, and my frame of reference is we described the neighborhood as it existed in 2001 with the publication of this book, Down at the Lake, and accompanying that 4 walking tours that are available online. And this is like a time capsule because the neighborhood is already experiencing some changes. What I would refer to as the third wave really started in the mid-'80s with the type of commercial occupancy in the business district and some newer infill and upgrading and starting with teardowns of construction. Since 2001, since the book was published, there have been several planning efforts or plans that the city has introduced. In 2013, there was a small area plan that the community was involved with the city planners, and that focused really on the areas of higher density along the commercial corridor, along Sheridan, coming through 43rd Street, and then along 44th Street. These were the commercial areas that had developed as part of the streetcar village and continue on with that higher density, both residential and commercial. And as of this past year, there is now a Minneapolis 2040 plan, which concentrates on we'll call it densification of the opportunities within the city and highlighting in a very detailed way the criteria for more significant, whether it's by height or number of units per acre, it's the density. So it doesn't so much affect Linden Hills outside of that same corridor, because even though on any lot now, which is previously a single-family zoned lot, you can build up to 3 units, from outward appearances where that may be built, it would appear for the most part to be one uniform building. And at least the experience to date in Linden Hills, and most likely in the immediate future, is that if somebody is tearing down a house, it's a very expensive proposition, and they are probably building a single-family home. But the appearance of most of those lots will not change significantly. So I mentioned that there's this period of change. Another thing that's changing in the mid-1980s is that the bandstand that I grew up with, that was built as a temporary bandstand in 1927 at Lake Harriet, comes down, and the park board hires Milo Thompson of Benz Thompson Rito to design a new Lake Harriet band shell. We're not calling it a pavilion anymore, but the seating is designed for 700 or so, and then a hillside connected from the lake shore up into the picnic grounds can accommodate several thousand people if a popular performer like the Minnesota Orchestra is performing. So that's a music legacy that is continued through all of these phases of development, but the parks are very actively used, considered to be regional assets at this point. And again, it's this tension between the near neighbors of the lake and the visitors, at least half of whom are not city residents. They're from the larger metropolitan area by this time. So this subject of teardowns, which is a little bit jarring to see sometimes because there are no design criteria as far as styles go, and it's up to every individual builder or property owner to choose a style. But having lived in the neighborhood for at least half my life and being actively involved still, as I go through the neighborhood, if I see a sign in front of a house, even from a distance, most likely it's going to be not simply this is for sale, but this is for sale as a buildable lot, even with a rendering of the specific home that's been designed that the builder is going to build for you. This is a home on Washburn, built in the early 1900s. Now the front porch has been stripped off in an earlier renovation. The entrance is now around the side, but you see the rendering of what the house will be that will replace that. And this is not atypical of what's happening almost randomly throughout the neighborhood. Initially, this trend over the last 20 years focused on homes that were smaller and needed a lot of work, didn't have the potential value that the location had, where a builder would come in and say, okay, I'm going to buy this relatively modest home. Instead of trying to add on to it or renovate it, I'm going to simply tear it down and build a new home. And that's happening not only in Linden Hills, but in the Fulton neighborhood to the south and the Edina community to the west, these areas in particular, but in many areas of the city. So what happens when somebody chooses their style of a house? Sometimes intentionally they'll do something that is complementary to the historic vernacular of the neighborhood, and sometimes it's entirely different, such as the home on the left, which is very contemporary. They've cut into the hillside. Instead of having a driveway come up the hill and around to a detached garage, they're going to go right into the hillside and have a tuck-under garage. Across the street from these homes on Zenith is a homeowner and designer who chose an entirely different approach, very unusual. Instead of tearing down the house, they're going to add on to the house. And just as with a historic designated structure, you want to differentiate the change to a house. This owner definitely expressed that addition in a contemporary vernacular attached to the traditional early 1900 home with the Dutch gambrel roof. So now we're going into back to some of the early Cottage City area homes and seeing what has happened to those. The teardowns didn't start in the last 20 years or even back to the mid-1980s. This was the Uland House. Again, it's the Hamilton House site where Thoreau stayed overlooking Lake Calhoun. And the Uland family decided to develop that parcel as a very unique setting with multiple unit buildings that appear to be large single-family homes with accessed underground parking accessed from the parkway. So that was the 1890 Uland House. This is the home that was built on the site of the May House, where they served meals. There's a little advertisement on the right. And in the 1950s, this home was built. It was a contemporary style. I think it was Gingold was the designer. And it's been well maintained, and some beautiful landscaping is currently for sale. And then the most prominent newer home in the community is this home that's on Sheridan, across the street from the home that we just saw, the old May Home site. And this home is the equivalent of an estate, something similar to what you'd see at the Bakken Museum, which was built as a private home. And it has the potential, I think, of someday being something like a conference center. It's a beautiful setting, a lot of attention given both to the design and the landscaping. So it's very unique property. Now back to Charlie and Maddie Mousseau sitting in front of their $200 log cabin that they built in 1900. This is not a fair comparison, but the home that is now on the site, because it's not an equivalent home, and the dollar has changed value, but I believe that this home sold for 10,000 times the original cost of building the log cabin. close to $2 million a few years ago. Mousseau had owned 3 lots along there and actually built 3 homes. The one on Upton was also built in a similar style recently. And this one, which was on Charlie's cabin site. And then the third one, away from Upton in mid-block, is actually the same shell internally as about 1905. At that time, instead of tearing down the entire house, it was built up and the character changed to be a little bit more contemporary. But somewhere in that third home's shell is Mousseau's third house on the site. I was just alerted to the loss of one of the oldest homes in Linden Hills, which was connected to the Grimes family. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Grimes family owned the property up to Beard, all the way from about 42nd to 48th Street. And they platted all of that in the 1880s. In this case, it's called Waveland Park. And there was a very large lot at the southwest corner of 44th and Beard that was set aside for one of Jonathan Grimes' son, George. And George had his home, the equivalent of about 4 lots or more at the corner. And that home survived until this past year, when it was taken down for the construction of this apartment building that you see now, not yet complete. In an aerial view, when I flew over at the beginning of this year, I happened to catch the immediate neighborhood. And so we lost, the home had been stuccoed over and it didn't have the same character, but it was not known to the city planning and historic staff that this was actually the George Grimes home with that continuity going back to 1885. The community extended really seamlessly past what is now the city boundary as of 1887 along France Avenue. This was all owned by the Grimes family, and in one direction it branched off to Sunnyside, named after Colonel Reeves' Sunnyside Farm, which Jonathan Grimes was well familiar with, so he got to name all the streets in the community. And then West 44th Street, which followed the old street or the streetcar line as it extended out to Lake Minnetonka, electrified in 1905. And so this is the community, which is Morningside to the west of France Avenue and Linden Hills to the east. The Sunnyside Gardens is a legacy business. The Moot family was one of the early residents that came in at the promotion of the Grimes family to Waveland Park, and that has survived first as a truck farm and now since later years continued as Sunnyside Gardens for now. And the other businesses, including what was owned by the Fairbairn family, one of the other early residents that came in with the Grimes interest. And they had a garage at the corner of 44th, or Sunnyside actually, and France, which next door to that was built the Westgate Theater, which we lost that building in the last year or two also for construction of this large apartment building. Interesting infill building along Sheridan in the 4200 block. I mentioned that before the zoning ordinance that you didn't have a restriction of one home on a given lot. I know of at least a half dozen properties in Linden Hills that still have a second residence that predated the zoning ordinance. In this case, in the Quigley's aerial photograph, at the bottom, there is a triangular or pie-shaped lot that actually had 3 homes built on it. That was built by August Olson, whose family lived on that block for 100 years. And Julie Snow's modern structure there took the place of that 3-home lot. So there's sort of a pattern here where the idea that you'd have 1 to 3 dwelling units on a site is not new to Linden Hills, but certainly is being reintroduced after 100 years. Very unique building that's currently still under construction, not quite occupied, is the 44 Commons building, designed by Christian Dean Architecture. And this is unique, as I call it, the second phase of Sebastian Joe's. The first phase was in the mid-'80s. Sebastian Joe's opened in Linden Hills, I think 1988, and the brothers owned the land up to 44th Street and considered for a number of years what to do with that property, and have just built it. It has a timber frame, and it responds to its context in the material selection of the metal cladding, which reflects the dome of the Lake Harriet Spiritual Center, originally at the Lake Harriet Methodist Church across 44th Street, and the light color brick also of the church. The wonderful roof terrace for the tenants of the upper level offices overlooking the neighborhood from this high point. And on 44th Street, just down the hill, we have another apartment building that's under construction on an unusually large lot that was very deep, going back to the original streetcar line, and then combined with a lot where a single-family home had remained. The first home that was taken down was where Brenda Euland lived the last decades of her life. And the developer, as a condition of the demolition of that home, has committed to public art, permanent public art, in honor of Brenda's writing career and her personality as deeply involved in the Linden Hills neighborhood. The home that was next door to Brenda's former home had quite an investment in it in recent years, and this is a very rare situation in which it was worth moving that home to a lot about a block away, a very elaborate undertaking. There's actually a video of the home being moved. You can see the complexity of how that occurred, but it's now being finished and is again being occupied. But that was part of the tradition for many years. If there was any possibility of moving even a modest home, it was moved to a less valuable property within the neighborhood. This is very unique and maybe the last time that has happening within the neighborhood. Something else that happened around 2000, the Park Board got together with the Watershed District, recognizing the water degradation in the city lakes of the storm runoff from the developed neighborhood, and reestablished wetlands along the shores of now Bedeh-Makaska and on the west side of Cedar Lake. And these filtration ponds have been very effective in upgrading the water quality in the chain of lakes. And as I mentioned, the Park Board staff referred back to Henry David Thoreau's notes from 1861 and chose some of the indigenous plantings of material that was along the lake shore at that time in the restoration of or recreation of this wetland and filtration system. Now, the bookend part of this is I originally conceived of the talk or the tour in terms of development and 3 phases. But somewhat unexpectedly, in the last 15 years, there has been a return of the awareness in the community of the Dakota heritage and connection to this site. One of the supporters of that is the Bakken Museum has been very involved, and they have planted a garden extending into the wetland towards the lake from their property on 36th Street. And it's a Dakota-themed garden with signage explaining how these were plants that were used by the Dakota for medicinal purposes. So even though it's a museum of electricity in life, the Bakken is very much engaged in more traditional healing also. It's sort of a dual nature of their mission, and they've been very active. And there's an exhibit on the roof terrace talking about the natural flow of water, the health of that environment, and the Dakota connection to the lake. Now, on the shores of Bde-Makaska, on the southeast shore, is this 1930 marker commemorating Cloudmen's Village. And pictured is Dr. Charles Eastman, or his Dakota name was Oyesa, who was nationally prominent as a Native American in writing about and continuing the legacy and teachings of the Dakota people, and specifically about American Indians nationally as well. And he was speaking in Minneapolis in 1930, actually at the dedication of the Father Hennepin statue in front of the Basilica of St. Mary, and was invited by the Board of Park Commissioners to address their board meeting, at which time he talked about his great-grandfather's village, Chief Cloudman's village on the lake, and this bronze marker was put up to commemorate that. There's an opportunity at that site that was created when the dual roadway was vacated in the 1970s, and that land has now been utilized as this commemoration site for both the village and the Dakota people and culture more generally. This past year was the dedication of the public art along the perimeter of this space, and the language that's used in the concrete sidewalk and along the fence speak to the village that was there, and it's a more peaceful and contemplative space for ceremony than the very active recreational trails that have existed there. So at the same time, in summary, that there have been these phases of development of the neighborhood, sort of wrapping that is what we had anticipated was strictly a past long-distant Dakota presence, and actually a reemergence as the Dakota sponsors of the renaming. It's a name restoration to the original Dakota name when we say Bde-Makaska. So we've got a lot of stories to tell, and the Linden Hills History Study Group has been very active for more than 20 years in presenting both stories of the immediate area and of local history more generally. So thank you, and we'll take some questions.
So we haven't received any questions. Does anybody have a question? If you'd like to ask Peter something, just unmute your microphone.
Joel and I have a question. It's Dick Cronick.
Yeah.
Peter, you said that Jonathan Grimes named all the streets in his development. So some of the streets in that area to the east edge are part of the alphabets. So was he involved in doing the alphabet?
No, he was a very accomplished person, but he did not name the Minneapolis street system. My reference was to two plats that the Grimes family filed. Actually, the original Waveland community was in 1880, and then part of that was replatted as Waveland Park. So if you go back to those plats from the 1880s, those street names, street names that don't exist today, like McLean, but others do survive, especially as you go into Morningside. He was naming streets for his children, like Alden. So it's not, when I was referring to street names, it's not so much most of the street names in Minneapolis at this time, although Motor Place, parallel to 44th Street between Beard and Chowan, was on the plat, and also Colgate and a few other, Glendale Terrace, I think, and Waveland Park, just north of 44th Street. Those names survive. So he he did. There's a legacy. It was a planned community that he had in mind, and that never really materialized besides a few families and the original Lake Harriet school site for a few years. But his son, George, did live there on the corner of 44th and Beard for about 30 years or more.
Peter, I have a comment. The home that my family first lived in when I was born was at 4259 Sheridan, where that 3-unit townhome is that you alluded to. Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. I know of those 3 homes. I grew up from the time I started walking around the neighborhood when I was in kindergarten. And I would go over to a friend's house and say, "What's that house doing in your backyard?" So I just became aware of a few things like that. But I had met August Olson's son, Harold, back in the 80s. And he's the one who mentioned to me that there were actually 3 homes on that site. And Harold also told me stories about when the new fire station was first opened. It was designed as the first fire station in the city of Minneapolis to accommodate motorized equipment, but they hadn't gotten the order yet. And there were actually horse-drawn equipment there initially, briefly. So it was my experience in the community dates back from as early as I can remember, and now I find myself some 60 years later looking back and appreciating some of the stories that people have told me over the years.
I have a nitpicky question or clarification. On the Giles house, I attributed that to John Yager. It was a collaboration with John Yager and Carl Strauss. And Strauss lived in the neighborhood and designed a couple apartment houses on the other side of the block from our house on Lake Harriet. And so anyhow, I just wanted to get that straight. And Dick Cronick and nod his head, I believe. He's looked into that.
So I'm not looking at the screen right now, but I recognize the voices of people who are asking the questions. And so Strauss was a partner of John Jager, and also somewhat of a collaboration on the Giles home was the owner, Robert Giles, who was a stained glass artist, and his wife, who was involved in the Minneapolis Handicraft Guild and teaching at the precursor to the College of Art and Design in fabric design and other areas. So it was some very creative people involved in a very unique home.
Hi, Peter. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, nice to see you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Do you know if any Preserve Minneapolis tours are going to be virtual like this on either Zoom or Google Meet?
Thank you for asking. I don't know if you're familiar with the program that's been started now and are just setting me up to talk about our tour program, because I am the chair of the Preserve Minneapolis tour program. And after 10 years of offering walking tours, this year the tour program is entirely virtual tours. It is on Zoom. We've had 2 of 18 tours so far. Joellen, in her introduction, did mention that if you go to our website of preserveminneapolis.org, I think it's under the events tab, you'll see the remaining 16 tours on there. I recognize at least one of the other tour guides on this program. Dick Cronick asked a question earlier, and Dick is leading or co-leading 3 of the tours that are upcoming. And I think that you'll recognize a few other of the presenters that have appeared before the Linden Hills History Study Group. So it's a a reasonable price, $6, including registration fees. And we've got some interesting tours coming up.
Teresa, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, I'm Teresa. I'm the supervisor at Linden Hills Library. And I have a question about Eli Pettyjohn. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? I believe he was the first person to own a lot of the land, taking the land grants in the area.
Yes, so as much as I described in the program, that just touches on the various aspects of the community's history. And I had mentioned the book published by the Linden Hills History Study Group in 2001, Down at the Lake, which has quite a bit more information. I have a list of my favorite people, many of whom, interestingly, lived until they were older than 80 years old back in those days. That was fairly unusual. So Eli Pettyjohn was interesting for a few reasons. One is he was the original landowner in a large tract of land south of 40th Street from Lake Harriet extending to Beard Avenue. And one of the things that I find interesting about him is he was Philander Prescott's son-in-law, the Indian agent, or the farmer for the Indian agent at the Cloudman's Village. And Prescott had a Dakota wife, and Pettyjohn married one of Prescott's children. So even though the Dakota were essentially exiled from the state of Minnesota, Pettyjohn's wife, who was Dakota, half Dakota, was one of the original landholders in the community. Strange how the history plays out. Pettyjohn is best known because he went into the cereal business. And if you go online and look up, I think it's Pettyjohn's Rolled Oats or some breakfast cereal, they had many years of very creative illustrated advertisements. So he was actually very successful in the food area, and that's the other thing I got a kick out of is that he lived long enough, having started out in the community at Fort Snelling in the 1830s, I think, and then claiming land at now Bede-Makaska and Lake Harriet. His funeral in about 1918 or 19 was led by a group of automobiles. So you can tell the span of his lifetime. But interesting, one of several interesting people in the story of the community's history.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay, well, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us this evening and encourage you, as Joellen said, to look at the calendar for the Linden Hills History Study Group. We have some upcoming programs, including the suffrage program coming up next. And I want to acknowledge August Schurtwager's technical expertise, and the only reason that we can accomplish this virtually is because of August's assistance. So we really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Let's try it again next month. Have a good evening.